Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video I thought it would be fun to talk about narrative and what it means specifically for our tabletop games. In this video we'll have a look at the definition and build from there, looking at how it can affect our terrain, the missions, the environment we do battle in, how we can recreate battles or homebrew our own, and really how we can tell our own stories that aren't just part of a campaign. And we'll also talk about list building. Even though we're going to build on the definition, this is really what narrative means to me. You might have a completely different view of it, and that's great. It's really cool. We don't all have to have the same perspective. And I'd love to hear what you think about narrative for tabletop skirmish games and bigger games like 40k and Age of Sigmar 2. So let me know in the comments section down below. It'd be awesome to hear what you think. Let's get into it then, and let's begin with the definition. So I went to dictionary.com where it tells us that narrative is a story or account of events, experiences or the like, whether true or fictitious. And the idea is that these events can be connected in some way. Let's take Warcry as an example, and if we say we're playing in a narrative way, maybe we're following the progress of one Warcry warband and their adventures through the 8 points. Or with a more up-to-date scenario, their journey through Gnarlwood and all the encounters and battles that they come across along the way. With that idea in mind, you can think of the narrative as the battles, what occurred in those battles and what the outcomes were, and then string those all together over time, and you've got yourself a linear narrative. Before we take a look at the Games Workshop definition of narrative play, I'd like to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping me keep going with these daily videos. I really appreciate that support. Couldn't do this without you, and I'm looking forward to sharing lots of narrative themed products and contents with you on the Patreon page. And if you'd like to join my Patreon or at least find out more about it, there's a link in the description down below. Be awesome to see you there. Right, let's get back to the Games Workshop definition. Games Workshop definition really focuses on the idea of recreating battles from the existing lore, maybe from books, maybe from articles, codexes, that kind of thing. And then they really go to town on the idea that a narrative play, or the way to play narratively, is to launch a crusade over a period of time as a campaign. That doesn't necessarily work for me, and as we go through the video, we'll talk about how a narrative game doesn't have to be part of a campaign, and that's something that I think we can come away from Games Workshop on with their definition. That's their perspective, but we can have one that's totally different. For me, narrative games are just good fun, and I'd much rather play a narrative game than a competitive list game, for example. I've been thinking a lot about narrative play over the last few months, and that's kind of where I'm heading now with the hobby, and you may see that coming across in some of the content I've been producing. Certainly on Patreon I've been making some different missions now with narrative in mind, and I'm really growing that idea. When you come away from existing lore and start to come up with your own narrative, if you like, then you can play the models you want to play, how you want to play them. And I love that idea. You're not being guided by the different lore, you're not being guided by the meta, and that's really important. You can enjoy this game and stop chasing the meta. You can start building lists that are more about telling a story rather than trying to just destroy your opponent and win the game. That said, that is fun to do as well, but that's like a different subject. So I think you've got two ways really to go about things. Narratively, where it's not the outcome, but the journey of getting there, and then the other side, which is full-on competitive play, which certainly has a place. I think in tournaments, you want to go there. You don't want to go there to lose. You want to go there to try and win. And so for me, I probably wouldn't play a narrative list in a tournament, whereas if I'm just playing for fun, I'd rather play a narrative list than a competitive list. Even though I've just said all that, you still can play competitively, and why not? Your list could be a strong list, and then you could play a narrative too. But in my mind, I've split them up into two different things, but they could certainly be the same thing. You could have a competitive list and then play that through narrative games as part of a campaign. But I just feel like if you're trying to be competitive, you have to keep up to date with the meta, and with all the changes to the rules, it can really affect different units and how good they are. So if you're trying to play competitively, it could get in the way of playing narratively. And I think that's why I've divided it in my mind into two separate ways to play. It's definitely going to affect your list building, as we saw with that winner at the LVO who went with the Blood Angels. That was a competitive list based on the rules updates, and so that the rules updates influenced that list rather than the narrative influence in the list. And I'll show you an example of a list that for me is 100% all about the narrative. And so here's my Catachans, some of the models that I want to put together in what I think would be a really fun list to play in a jungle environment. At the top you can see we've got Colonel Strachan, that's going to be the HQ choice for the army, and then you've got 2 elites in Harker and Sly Marbo. Then you've got 4 squads of Catachans, and then 1 Ratling, 1 elite squad of Ratlings to get stuck in there. Then you've got 2 Scout Sentinels, 2 Chimeras, and 2 Hellhounds. In competitive play, I imagine this would be totally destroyed. And if you look at the different armies and lists you can put together for the Astra Militarum now, you'd probably want to go with some tanks, right? Rather than these. But I don't imagine tanks fitting in with this list here. And I imagine this is like some kind of patrol going through the jungle. You've got the Chimeras breaking the way with the bulldozers on there. You've got the 2 Hellhounds following up with the ability to just torch the whole jungle and any crazy beasts or enemy that exist in there. The Scout Sentinels are maybe going to the sides a little bit, and then you've got all your troops either on the Chimeras or coming along behind, marching along behind them, or maybe in the jungle ahead scouting to see what's going on. There's no command squad there, there's no Ogrins or Bulgrins or anything like that, no tanks, no heavy support whatsoever, but I think it would be a fun list to play. And imagine this in a jungle board all set up, and then maybe some terrain rules as well, which we'll talk about later on. I think this would be awesome. I love the idea of being able to tell your own stories. You can choose your favourite models, take them on an adventure, and document what happens along the way. You don't even have to have any structure to this. You can simply play games maybe at your local club against people who aren't playing in a campaign, and let the results then influence where you want to take your army or your warband into the next battle or on their next adventure. On the other hand, you can make some structure for this, or a lot of structure. It can be really complicated. You could make decision trees and all sorts of things going on. The outcome of one battle could split out into 2 different directions, and then you could go on and play another battle depending on the result. But you can keep it simple too. So having those 2 options is really great, and of course everything in between is going to work as well. It's really a personal thing, and at the end of the day we just want to play with our armies, get them on the table, roll some dice and have a good time. Going back to Games Workshop definition, where they focus on one of the options being to recreate battles, I do like that idea, especially if you just read a book. I remember reading Battle of the Fang. I thought it'd be awesome to play that out, get Bjorn and the Wolves out and have a go at the Thousand Suns. I don't think the outcome would be quite the same as the book though, but a really fun thing to do. And then looking at the existing lore, you could also take that existing lore and influence missions that you want to create yourselves that aren't based on recreating any battles. You know, it's such a huge universe. You could imagine all the different things that could have gone on within or in between these key events that we see in the lore. And so you could literally make anything up, but let the existing lore influence your decisions. Personally, I'm a writer. I like to come up with my own worlds, my own stories, my own lore, and so homebrewing lore is the thing I'd like to do. Even coming completely out of the 40k universe, Age of Sigmar, not going anywhere near that, but creating my own games. I'm all constantly thinking about different scenarios, different armies, different war bands, teams, things you can put together to tell stories with. So I love the idea that you can create your own lore, but using the models you've got and then just build around those. So often I'll take a model I think looks really cool and I can come up with a scenario I want to play out just based on that, especially for things like playing Dungeons and Dragons, like tabletop role-playing games. That's a big influence for me. The model can give me some ideas to work off, to put together little stories, little missions to play. But the same thing goes for skirmish games. So Weekend Warriors, my book, that's all about coming up with your own worlds and your own adventures. Creating custom missions is really fun, so I love coming up with ideas for that. Really cool. And so a great way, if you've got an idea in mind, you could just play a one-off mission and just play that out, see what happens. Or you can make a series of missions that do string along, and then that would be part of a campaign. But it's great to have that option. If you're not into that idea of creating your own missions and your own worlds and lore and things, then that's cool too. Use all the existing lore and then use hundreds of existing missions that exist and pick out ones that you think will work for you and will help you take your narrative forward. Now this could be any mission or quest from any of the Warcry books, the Kill Team books, 40k books, White Dwarf, the Imperium magazine, literally comes with a mission in almost every issue, so you're going to have almost 90 missions just from the Imperium magazine collection that you could play out and you could tweak and incorporate into your own narrative. Of course, this applies to other games too, not just Games Workshop games, and you can also take from other games and bring those missions in to work for you as well. A lot of the way that these missions are worded aren't specific to games, so you can take them into different games and use them, or just take parts from a few different missions and mash them all together. I've been enjoying this recently, the Critical Ops, TAC Ops and Mission Card Pack. Nicely, concisely worded there, great title for a product. And so I think this is a really cool way that you can use match play tools to help you in your narrative. The way that this goes together, the mission generation is completely random, and then you can use that to come up with different missions. But instead of being random, you can read through it and think, this map will work really well with the idea I've got for this mission, which is very similar to how this mission A is worded. So I'll put those two together and I'm good to go. Unfortunately, those cards were made, they didn't make enough. They only let shops have maybe 2 copies to sell, and they sold out really quick. But if you didn't manage to get in your own, then check out my video, which I'll link to at the end of this video, where I made my own, and I posted how I did it, and my finished progress on my Patreon page for anyone to have a look at and do what they like with the PDF. So there we go. We'll check that out at the end of the video. There'll be a link there to that. Another cool thing about narrative play is that you can bring in different rules. So you could bring in environmental rules. And I've been thinking about this over the last few days as I'm working through my new book. Think about how the weather can influence the battle. Maybe a storm, high winds, that's going to affect flyers, and even skimmers. That's going to have effect on how those work. Maybe even jetpacks are going to be affected by the weather. A violent comet storm could come down and actually do damage across the battlefield. For example, a comet could randomly land in a section and do D3 damage to all units within 6 inches of where it landed. Someone I was playing at my local club on Wednesday suggested the idea of the carnivorous trees and using the jungle to come alive when I was playing with the Catachan. So all this is going to really add to the narrative, and certainly with the Catachan in the jungle, where on the death world all these violent creatures exist. The trees come to life and do damage. So building those rules and mechanics into your games, I think is brilliant fun to bring the games alive. I think with narrative play, you're just encouraged to do things like this. Homebrew fun rules, come up with extra things, little twists that come away from what can often be quite boring when you're just trying to kill each other constantly. Make little fun rules that not only bring the environment and nature into the game, but other things too around objectives. I mean, there's just so much you can do and so much you can add to it. And as it's not competitive, it really doesn't matter. Terrain's a really fun part of narrative play too, when you're designing the board and setting out the terrain and thinking about how you're going to bring objectives into it. What's the terrain going to do? How's it going to affect those objectives? That's all really fun. And I think the Warhammer Plus, I'm not signed up to it anymore, I cancelled it quite quickly, but with battle reports I did watch, I think they did a really good job of doing that. They would make these terrain setups for the different battles and then bring in some existing lore and combined all that to tell a story through single battles. So those battles weren't part of a campaign. I think they did that really well. So that's a really nice example of how you can use terrain in your narrative games too. I think once you start growing an army, you want to keep playing it, but you don't have to do these narrative campaigns in a linear fashion. You can just dip in and out, take your army, have a battle here, finish that, have a battle somewhere else, see what goes on, and then in your mind you're just building up all these experiences, and that's forming how your army develops and maybe influencing how you're going to do new lists and things like that. But it certainly doesn't have to be linked, as the definition at the beginning of the video suggested. And the final thing I think we should mention, because if you're thinking of narrative play, maybe you're put off by the aftermath sequence. You don't want to go through all of that. I think it can be fun, the aftermath sequence for different campaigns. Certainly in Warcry and Kill Team, I think they're really good, but you don't have to do that either. So you don't have to worry about injuries and things like that. You can literally play the game and don't worry about who died or what's happened to them or who got injured. Literally just play the game, and then when you want to play a next game, you can just carry on. You don't have to worry about any aftermath or bookkeeping at the end of the game. So don't let that put you off where narrative play is concerned. There we go. We started with the definition of narrative and then went through the terrain, missions, homebrew, environment, telling a story. And again, this is all from my perspective, and I'd love to hear your perspective, so let me know in the comments section down below. Most of all though, I think narrative play is all about fun, playing with the models you want to play and how you want to play them to tell a story. Thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so looking forward to reading those comments. If you'd like to find out more about my Patreon, then that link is down in the description below, where I share lots of cool stuff, and there's going to be a massive focus on narrative play in my Patreon over the next few months for sure. So really looking forward to sharing all that. But thanks again for watching. If you did like the video, please hit the like button, subscribe as well. That's really helpful. I'd appreciate it if you like the videos to consider subscribing, and I look forward to seeing you here next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.